Hey guys, Constance here from Cosmopolitan Cornbread. So I have done a couple of projects in addition to all of the canning and dehydrating and food preservation stuff I've had going on. The other day I got motivated and I went to the hardware store, I grabbed a few things, and I came home and I got to work. So first of all, this is where my dishwasher used to be, and I went ahead and pulled it out because the one that was in here when we bought the house didn't really work very well. I mean, it didn't work at all, really. And so we went ahead and pulled it out, and I didn't replace it. I do not mind washing dishes. I actually find it kind of relaxing, and I feel like I can get the dishes washed a whole lot quicker than a dishwasher can with less energy and all that. So we went ahead and removed it. And I hung this curtain. This is that kind of ticking fabric, very classic. And behind there, I went ahead and I added some shelving. I've got a couple egg cartons here, just super simple. Some pine boards. I actually found one with some live edge on there, which I love. Nice and easy, extra storage that I could definitely use here in my kitchen. So this was the first project. Then I grabbed the other wood that I bought at the store and I got started on a second one. With all of the canning and everything that's been taking place, food storage is a critical thing. And so I decided to make a can rack to hold all of my store-bought cans. That way I could use my limited shelving just for all of the jars and all of the home preserved things. So this is the can rack that I built. It has 12 slots and the cans go in here at the top, go right down there, and then there's a space down at the bottom where I can pull one out, and then they just kind of continue to drop down. So it's a great way to have a rotation system for your cans. That way the older ones are being used first and the newer ones are on top. And we set it down on the ground just because we do have shelving up on the wall above it, and it lets me use the top of it for things that are just kind of like the onesie twosie sorts of things. Stuff that I don't really have a ton of, and so I don't want to have a whole column set up for those. But this is just an added shelf, added storage that I can put these sorts of things on. So the entire frame is made out of 1x4s, and the fronts are just simple little 1x3s. The 1x4s were about $4 and change a piece. The 1x3s here, which I probably should have sanded these, wasn't thinking. The 1x3s, these keep the cans in the columns, and those were $1 and change, like just about $2 a piece. So altogether, it really wasn't very expensive to make this. The columns are 5.5 inches wide, and I did that so that if I have any cans that are larger, I'll be able to fit them in there. I mean, these do have a little bit of wiggle room, but they're fine because the boards in the front keep them in place. And then the bottom board is actually connected at a slight angle, about 15 degrees, tilted up in the front. That way the cans don't all just roll right out. So this was my second project that I did. And then my third project was another one that was kind of a long time coming. I headed out here into the kitchen and I thought, well, I've got my nail gun out, I've got my saw out, it's time to trim the ceiling. So finished up the ceiling. The only thing that's left to do, of course, as you can see, is to paint the wood. I just used a very basic 1x2 board. I wanted very clean lines, very simple and rustic, and we went all the way around the kitchen, of course, going around the cabinets and all of that. And I will paint the wood to match the ceiling, which is Dove White. And then the kitchen will be complete. Although I do have one more project that I have added to my list, but it's not something I'm going to do anytime soon. it'll be a down the road sort of thing because I have to hire somebody to do something for me. So projects galore. So you could probably hear the sound of my dehydrator going over there in the corner of the kitchen here. I'm getting ready to work on canning some of my peppers. I'm gonna do pepperoncinis. I had a lot of people ask me what I do with all of these peppers because yesterday alone I picked a ridiculous amount of peppers, and the short answer is a little bit of everything, depending upon what the peppers or what variety of peppers it is. If it is something that I will generally use in recipes fresh or diced up, then what I will do is I will dice them up as though I'm putting them in a recipe, and I will freeze them. And I freeze them, and I kind of touched on this in a previous video, I believe. I will dice them up, things like bell peppers or the sweet Lycia or the Myra peppers, things that are hardy that you would dice up for recipes. I will dice them up as though I'm about to use them in something that I'm cooking, but then I will spread them out on a baking sheet, let them freeze. Once they're frozen, then I'll put them into a freezer container and then put that container back in the freezer. And the reason I do that is so that the peppers aren't frozen into a solid clump. Because they're all already frozen, when you put them in the container, they don't freeze solid, and it makes it much easier to just get out a little bit at a time and to use in portions. So that is what I'll do with some of the peppers. Peppers that are generally for seasoning, like the paprika peppers, those I generally dehydrate because my goal for those is to grind them up into my own paprika powder. And so things like that, chili powders, cayenne, Chinese 5 colors, those are all peppers that I usually dehydrate. Sometimes I will pickle some of those as well, but those mostly just get dehydrated. Now I got a gazillion pepperoncinis. They are definitely prolific producers. This year, I mean, I by far have got way more of those than any other kind of pepper. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to be canning them, and I just use a very simple recipe. It doesn't have a lot of sugar or anything like that in there. They're not sweet. They're more for using for recipes later on and adding flavor to your recipes. So it's just a great way to preserve them. I'm going to do the pepperoncini peppers, and I'm also going to pickle a few of the jalapeno peppers today as well. Alright, so it's been a few hours since I was in here in the kitchen. I've actually been doing a few other things. Now I'm going to get started, well, I have gotten started working on pickling my peppers. I had a listing that I saw where a business in the area had pallets, and I need some pallets for a project that I'm going to be doing down the road, and I'm like, oh, free pallets, they're available, let me run and grab them while I can. So I got out there to where this business was, and not only did they have pallets, but they had a couple bundles of these boards, these perfectly trimmed, heat-treated, kiln-dried boards. And we're like, well, if you need some wood, you can take those too, because the person had ordered them to do like a plank wall or something in their house, and then they never used them. These bundles of wood were actually pallet boards that had never been put together as a pallet. So it was hundreds of boards, pallet boards, no holes, no nails, no screws, no nothing, pristine condition. So I got a ton of them and came home, unloaded, went back and got another whole truckload. And I don't have plans for them immediately, but buddy, if you've got an opportunity for free wood, who's gonna turn that down? Because when you got a homestead, there's always gonna be a need for some sort of boards for something. So I got them, brought them home, stacked them up on some pallets, covered them up with a tarp, and I've got wood. And so now I'm just thinking, what could I do with all of those boards? but that will be for another day. Right now I've got the brine going for my peppers. I am pickling pepperoncini peppers, and the brine that I have here is 8 cups of water, 8 cups of white vinegar, a third of a cup of canning salt, and a half a cup of sugar. And that is the basic brine. I'm going to bring this all to a boil. So while that is heating up, I'm going to start packing my jars with all of the peppers. Some of the peppers I'm going to leave mostly whole. I'll kind of split them down the middle, and then a bunch of the peppers I'm going to just cut into circles, discs of sorts. And I'm going to be putting on some gloves because I made the mistake the other day of doing a bunch of stuff with peppers. Forgot to put gloves on, and yeah, it wasn't, let me just say, it was not a good experience taking my contacts out that night with Chinese 5-color pepper residue on my fingers. So I'm going to don some gloves and get to work. Alright, so I've got my jars filled with the pepperoncini peppers, and one of the jars I left the peppers mostly whole. I just split them down the center, and then the rest of them are just cut into rings. And in every jar I'm putting a crushed clove of garlic, I'll put 2 in there if they're kind of tiny. Got a couple extra cloves, so let me just toss them in there. Alright, and then I'm putting in a tablespoon of peppercorns. I already did the back row. And 1/8 of a teaspoon of pickle crisp. And that will, as the name sounds, it'll help your peppers stay crispy and not get mushy as they have been canned. A lot of people will only use pickle crisp for cucumber pickles, but it's good for anything that you pickle, really. Alrighty. Let me grab my ladle. Then I have my brine over here that has boiled, and I just reduced the heat a little bit so it's still nice and hot, but not screaming hot. And we're going to ladle this in. And I'll ladle it almost to the top. I won't quite fill it to where I would for the canning process, because I'm going to take my bubble wand and I'm going to wiggle it around in there to make sure there's no air pockets. And I don't want to, ooh, I actually kind of filled that one a little bit. That's okay. I'm going to take my bubble wand and I'm going to move it around in the jar, make sure there's no air pockets inside all of these peppers. And then once I've done that, a lot of times the level of the liquid will drop down, and you're going to have to add a little bit more canning liquid to the jar anyways. So I don't worry about getting it exactly where it needs to be the first go round. And this brine, I tend to do it in big batches because it's good for a lot of things. You can pickle peppers, you could pickle cucumbers, pretty much anything you want to in this this same brine, if I was doing cucumbers, making cucumber pickles, I would basically do it the exact same way, but I like to add dill to my jars. And so I would add about a teaspoon of dry dill, or like a head of fresh dill if you happen to have it. Unfortunately, the beautiful black swallowtail caterpillars kind of devoured my fresh dill, so that's just the way it works sometimes. Alright, now normally you would like to pack these jars down nice and tight and get a ton of peppers in there. And most of my jars are really packed full. This last jar, I didn't have quite enough peppers to fill it up as much as the others, but that's okay. As long as you've got the brine filling it up to the top where it needs to be, then you're good to go. And so I just take the bubble wand and I work around in there, move the peppers around, make sure there's no air pockets. And like I said, you can use this brine for a lot of things, and I didn't use it all. I've still got a good bit in my pot there, and so what I'll do is I'll just let that cool down and pour it into a container, put it in the fridge, and I can use it for my next round of canning tomorrow. Now this one's a little tricky because it's those whole peppers that are just split, and generally when I see recipes for, you know, basically whole peppers like this, they tell you to just cut a slit on each side, but I find that if I do that, that pepper is hollow and it's full of air, and if I don't split it completely in half, those peppers want to come flying out of the top of the jar because they want to float as soon as you put the liquid in there. And so what I do is I just split the pepper all the way in half, leaving it connected at the stem end, and go from there. Now you could also add some crushed red pepper to this if you wanted to. I don't generally do that because I feel like pepperoncini peppers got plenty of flavor. You don't add any more heat to them. You can also use less peppercorns. You don't have to use a whole tablespoon. You could just use like a teaspoon or so if you wanted to, or half a teaspoon, or just, you know, a few. It really is according to your taste when it comes to the peppercorns. You could use a little less garlic. You could leave out the garlic if you wanted to. All right, so the headspace for this particular recipe is 1/4 of an inch, and your headspace is basically the distance between the very top edge of your jar and the top of the food or liquid, the contents of the jar. And my little bubble wand is pretty handy. It has these little notches, so you can tell exactly when you are right where you need to be. Of course, if you do this enough, you get pretty good at judging that distance. Not too hard to tell what 1/4 of an inch is when you've done this quite a bit. So now I'm just going to take damp rag and I'm going to wipe the tops of all of these so that if there's any of the brine or any seeds or anything on top there, we'll have a nice clean edge of the jar so that the lids can seal properly. Because if there's food on there, sometimes the lid just can't get a good seal, and then you have a failure of your canning process. And you know, if you just have 1 or 2 jars where it doesn't seal properly, it's not the end of the world. You can just take that jar, stick it in the fridge, and use it soon, you know. But I very rarely have a lid not seal. That's not something I have happen too often. Now the other day I was using those resealable lids for the first time, and I did have one of them not seal. but I know that those kinds of lids have a learning curve, and that was my first and only time I've ever used those. So I know it's going to take a little bit of practice, and one jar of jalapeno jelly not sealing is definitely not the end of the world. And it just went into the fridge and is being enjoyed. So as I'm closing these up, I'm just closing them snugly. I'm not cranking it down super hard. Just snug. Now these would can in a hot water bath canner or steam canner like I like to use. And alrighty. Okay, so I've got my jars here in my steam canner. I've already had the water in the bottom here heating up, so it won't take very long for my canner to get up to the proper temperature. You would can these in either a hot water bath canner or a steam canner like this. Basically anything you can do in a hot water bath canner, you can also do in one of these steam canners. I love my steam canner. I just think it's so much easier than the big giant pot of hot water that heats up your whole kitchen. It takes less energy to heat this up, and it cools down much quicker when you're finished. Not to mention, it's a lot lighter to move around. So I'm going to put the lid on and let this get heated. Alright, so my canner is just about heated up. It is almost in the green. This particular version of steam canner has a little gauge on top, so you know exactly when your steam canner has reached the right temperature. Now, your stove, you don't have to have it full blast to get it up to temperature. If you have it going too high, this will actually start shooting water out, spitting water out the sides, and the lid will start lifting up. So it doesn't have to be full blast in order to bring it up to temperature. You just want a good rolling boil. If your steam canner starts to do that, you just want to lower the heat down a little bit. So once this gets up to temperature, which we are there, I can turn this down just a little bit. The peppers go for 10 minutes. Exactly the same as if it was in a hot water bath canner. And now we wait. Alright, so the timer went off and I have let the canner sit here for just a few minutes with the lid kind of cocked a little bit. And so now I'm going to take them out and gently move the jars over to the counter that is lined with towels. You could also put your jars on a cooling rack if you wanted to. But when you are moving your jars, you don't want to tilt them at all, because what can happen is the liquid that's in your jars could get up under that lid, because that lid is not yet sealed. Everything is heated, everything is up under pressure, and as the jar cools, that's when it's going to suction down and that seal is going to happen. So now they're just going to sit here in that spot until tomorrow. Alright, so pepperoncini peppers are a Greek pepper, and they're kind of a medium heat sort of pepper. They're not a sweet pepper like a bell pepper or anything like that. They do have a little bit of a bite to them, but they're not an intense pepper. They're not hot like, say, a cayenne. They're just a medium heat sort of pepper. And one of the things I like to use the pickled pepperoncini peppers for is a roast beef recipe that I do. It is called peppered beef. I have the recipe on my blog, cosmopolitancornbread.com. And it is a slow cooker recipe, and you cook the roast beef in the slow cooker, and you've got the peppers and all these seasonings in there, and the meat ends up just being fall apart tender, and you actually shred it and you put it on buns or rolls, and it's for peppered beef sandwiches. Now you don't have to, of course, serve it as a sandwich. You can just serve it as roast beef, but it has a ton of flavor, it is delicious, and it is a great way to use some of the pepperoncini peppers. And really, you can add them to anything that you would add pickled peppers to. There's lots of recipes that you could use them for. You can put them in chili. Just because they're a Greek pepper doesn't mean you can't do that. Anything you want a little bit of spicy, peppery flavor to, you can use those peppers. And again, you can use this exact same recipe for pickling jalapeno peppers. You can do it for banana peppers. So any sort of pepper like that can easily be pickled using this exact same recipe. So I will put a printable version to this recipe on my blog, and I will put a link to that down below or up here in a card, depending on where you are watching this video. And with that, I will go ahead and wrap this up for today. Thanks for joining me here in the homestead kitchen. My name is Constance from Cosmopolitan Cornbread, and I'll talk to y'all next time.